what the reviews were saying is that, virtually the entire American intellectual community was deciding to accept a sort of Stalinist-style fraud because it's in the interests of their particular politics, even though the thing is so transparently fraudulent that it falls apart as soon as you look at it. That was embarrassing. And the thing disappeared. Nobody said, gee, I'm sorry, I lied about it. But it kind of disappeared, and now you're not allowed to talk about it anymore. Okay, that's basically the story. There's a lot more to it, which is even uglier, but that's more or less it.
I can make one more statement. This is for radio purposes, sorry. We are at Cambridge Forum discussing the U.S. and the Middle East peace process with Professor Noam Chomsky.
Roger Eisner, Radio Free Maine. Anniversaries. This is the 30th anniversary of the bombing, shelling, whatever, of the USS Liberty in waters off of Israel. Can you update us as to, is this ever going to get out in public as to what happened? And also, on your information, what do you speculate the reasons for Israel attacking the USS Liberty?
You know this story. There was this is during the 1967 war, right? There was a U.S. spy ship, Liberty, unarmed, kind of electronic, picking up electronic communications in the Mediterranean. And it was attacked by Israeli torpedo boats and planes. Remind me about the numbers. I think about 30 or 40. 38 American sailors were killed and like a couple hundred wounded. The ship was almost sunk, not quite. It was able to kind of limp back to Naples, where it came from. What happened is, I'll go into what happened. There's no doubt that it was attacked by Israel. That's not in question. At first it was denied, but by now it's not denied any longer. The thing was kind of hushed up. There was a Naval Board of Inquiry hearing which shut it up, and the Liberty sailors are pretty angry about it. And they have an organization which still exists, which is trying to get some publicity for this. They got plenty of high-level people saying this was just a straight attack, admirals and secretaries of state and so on and so forth. But the thing is just embarrassing. Nobody wants it out. So there's no compensation. I think maybe there was some kind of compensation, but virtually nothing. Anyway, it's a non-existent thing. Why did Israel do it? Well, we don't have the documents, but my own speculation is that it was done probably to prevent the United States from getting the information that that Israel was planning to invade the Golan Heights. The United States was not in favor of that. The United States did support Israel in the war, but after the ceasefire, Israel invaded the Syrian Golan Heights. After the ceasefire. And the United States was not happy about that because it was extremely dangerous. Could have led to a nuclear war. That war was a very close thing. If you can believe Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, his words are, we damn near had war with the Russians. The documents have still not come out, so we're relying on secondary commentary. But it appears as if there was a direct confrontation between the American and Russian fleets in the Mediterranean, and the American fleet sort of turned around the Russian military vessel, and it could have been a war. There was a hotline. We know there were hotline communications right at the end, in which Kosygin was saying, if you want war, you'll have war, and so on. Call off the Israelis or else, And right at the end of this, Israel invaded a Russian ally, Syria, and conquered the Golan Heights. And there's a good chance, I think, this is guessing, remember, that they did not want the United States to know that they were going to do it, because it would have been stopped. If the U.S. had known, they probably would have stopped it, not because they had any objection to it, but because it could have caused a war. That's my guess. But there's a lot of strange things about this. So, for example, if you read Yitzhak Rabin's memoirs, he was chief of staff, and his memoirs came out, and he writes all about this. In fact, he says the bombing of the Liberty was the worst moment in the Six-Day War. That's when we thought we're really in bad trouble, and it was the worst moment there, and big issue. He misdates it by a day. He puts it a day earlier than it happened. That's not the kind of mistake that the chief of staff can make about the most serious event that took place during the war. According to his dating, it wouldn't have had anything to do with the Golan Heights. Well, I don't know. Suspicions. Nothing has come out that's definitive, but that's my guess. When the ship was attacked, it did manage to radio back to the Sixth Fleet in Naples, saying we're under attack by some foreign. They didn't exactly know at first who it was. They said we're under attack by torpedo boats and planes, protect us. And apparently the Sixth Fleet did send off bombers. I think F-4 bombers, if I remember. But American military preparations were such that they only had nuclear-armed bombers. So they sent off nuclear-armed bombers from Naples to bomb somebody, like not knowing no specific target, like maybe Egypt or maybe Russia or whoever it might be who was attacking this ship. And at that point, it could have well been under the control of the flight commanders. They were apparently called back by the Pentagon, just very last minute, which might have also averted a nuclear war. When it finally became clear that it was Israel, they just backed off. And there's other stories if you want to really feel chills up and down your spine. The U.S. command in Washington knew that the Liberty was in danger. And a couple of days earlier, they sent communications to it to say, get out of this zone because it's a dangerous zone. The trouble is, all the fancy communications, military communications that you guys pay for, worked as follows. The message didn't go to the Liberty. Because of some error, it was sent to the Philippines, And when they got it in the Philippines, they, somehow, I don't know, they sent it somewhere else, I think North Africa or someplace. I mean, it took a couple of days for it to, I may have the details wrong, some story like this. It finally did get to the Liberty, but only after it was being bombed, So that's military communications. But the heart of the story is it's being silenced. It's being silenced because it's just too embarrassing. And the Liberty sailors don't like it, and plenty of other people don't like it, but it hasn't reached the public domain, much. I don't know of any new information about it, really.
There's one success story in Arab-Israeli-Jewish relationships, and that's a small village of Neve Shalom. I don't know if you're familiar with that, in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. And for 25 years, Arabs and Jews have lived voluntarily side by side as neighbors. The only place in Israel where they send their kids to the same schools to learn Hebrew and Arabic. Otherwise, they're separated. And they've trained 20,000 people in conflict resolution and negotiation. Now, I'd like your opinion. Why is this such a tough sell? I write part-time for the Globe. I came back from seeing this. I told the foreign news editor it's a terrific story, some good news, some solutions, not just problems out of Israel. What he told me was, look, he says, give me a good bombing or an assassination, I'll put it on page 1 or 2, but peace between Arabs and Jews, that's not news. Now, why is it such a tough sell to get some positive news, to get some solutions? And there are some. This is a prototype. It could serve as a model for, for successful living and coexistence. They worked out a lot of ways to do it. Why is it such a tough sell?
Well, here I partly agree with your editor. I don't think I think it's a really interesting story, but I don't think it's news in the sense of a way to solve the problem. Much more relevant to solving the problem would be for the United States to abandon its extreme rejectionist stance. If the United States were to join the rest of the world, I'm not talking about anything radical, just join the rest of the world in accepting what is a long-standing international consensus, virtually unanimous, in favor of a settlement that recognizes both Jewish and Palestinian national rights and involves Israeli withdrawal according to U.S. policy. If the U.S. were to move to that, that would probably settle the problem too. That's a much bigger issue. Why can't that get in the Globe? I mean, I'll tell you why, because I've been trying to get it in for 30 years. Including, I was a friend of I don't know what happened to this, but I mean, I don't know if I want to say this in public. I'll tell you in private if I like. I'll tell you in private if I like, because I've been through this with the editors. back as far back as the late 60s. And they simply will not break ranks on this one. And, in a way I don't blame them. Like if they were to publish this and it weren't to appear anywhere else, they'd look crazy. I mean, if they were to publish the straight facts about the diplomatic record, I mean, you shouldn't believe what I told you tonight. Look it up, Okay, it's all public documents. If I'm not telling the truth, you'll find it very fast. But if what I said is correct, and I think you'll find that it is, it wouldn't be very hard to, it changes the story quite radically. Try to find it somewhere. But if the Globe were to break ranks on this and to publish things that you don't find in the scholarly literature and that the New York Times won't publish and so on and so forth, they couldn't get away with it. Even if they wanted to, which they don't, because they're just as committed to the same policy. I mean, they're the same, part of the same liberal establishment that says this is what we want, As to this story, I mean, I think they might run it on the style page. A human interest story, Jews and Arabs get
7 months and 7 editors, and it ran in the education.
Yeah, okay. I picked the wrong one, but it'll run as a human interest story somewhere. But if it is going to interfere with the radically rejectionist policy of instituting a Bantustan-style settlement and calling it peace, it's not on the front page any more than this other stuff is. It's a very tough sell, you're right.
Yeah, it's a tough sell. I mean, they want violence, they want problems.
It's not that they want violence and problems, they want solutions that fit U.S. power interests.
Well, that's violence and problems.
Not necessarily. Like, for example, they were perfectly happy to feature on the front page the signing of the Declaration of Principles on the White House lawn with a headline saying, Day of Awe, Okay, Day of Awe, Palestinians surrender, give up, and the United States wins and rams through its rejectionist program. That wasn't violent, but it was a day of awe, with everyone falling all over themselves and, adulation of American nobility and so on. So it's not just violence, it's servility to power. That's what they want.
You mentioned in a previous talk that one thing we could do here is to focus on the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on this issue. I'd like you to say a bit about that, and was there any reception for the notion of anti-apartheid as a campaign when you were in Israel just recently? Did anybody seem to say, oh yeah, this is something we can actually talk about? Yeah. And my third question, actually, is this whole notion of Netanyahu withdrawing funds from the PLO. I mean, what is the states doing about this? If the PLO is there to enforce, this whole security thing, then putting them in a position where they can't pay their, police, and there have been reports that a lot of the police are getting ready to have some sort of a, insurrection. I mean, don't you think that's incredibly shocking?
Can't pay their police, but that's not the whole story. Remember, can't pay their police means can't pay the forces that are carrying out indigenized repression. The police are very brutal, They probably have the highest proportion of police per capita, I guess, in the world. The police work very closely with Israeli intelligence, and they repress the population. They torture, they arrest, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'll tell you, all about it. Furthermore, when Israel isn't paying the funds, that means Arafat's not squirreling away more funds in his private bank account in Bank Leumi, to pay off his cronies and so on and so forth. I mean, it's tricky. Furthermore, when they don't pay off the funds, the European Union pays, or the World Bank pays. Okay, they don't like it, Like you read the London Financial Times, they're kind of unhappy about having to pay off, the Palestinian administration, or mostly gangsters, incidentally, because Israel's withholding funds, and the United States doesn't like it either. I mean, one of the things that when Albright was over there and she gave him a few taps on the wrist, one of them was release the funds because, we don't like to pay it this way. So yeah, it's counterproductive from the U.S. point of view, and they'll make them stop. In fact, they're starting to pay the funds again. But I think that's kind of like a technical issue. I mean, cutting off funds had nothing to do with terror or anything else. Just It's like the closures, which also have nothing to do with terror, just punishment. I mean, the way the closures work, if you really want to look at it, I mean, you know this, but so, for example, if there's an Arab terrorist act, Palestinian population is locked into their villages and so on. What happens when there's a Jewish terrorist act? Same thing, you know. So after, literally, Baruch Goldstein, this American immigrant, killed, 29 people or so in a mosque, you know, sprayed them with an assault rifle or whatever he did. The Israeli army, the Arab population of Hebron was placed under tight curfew and stayed that way, a very punitive curfew. The Israeli army went through and smashed up the Arab market, destroyed it. You know, it still hasn't been rebuilt and never will be rebuilt because the new Hebron settlement doesn't allow it. And there's a whole bunch of punishments of the Palestinians for the fact that an American Jew murdered 29 people in a mosque. Well, yeah, that's the way it works. And it works that way because folks here pay for it and say, let it keep going. This particular punitive act was like a mild one as compared with others. Incidentally, when you compare Labor and Likud, people say how terrible Netanyahu is and so on, which is true, he's pretty awful. But the fact is, with regard to the Palestinians, in some ways he's better than Labor. So like he's relaxed the harsh labor closures. More Palestinians are allowed to go in and be slave laborers in Israel than they were under Labor. Okay? And, they don't like being slave laborers, but it's better than starve and seeing your children starve. Okay? So it's a mixed story, On the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's a very important issue. You can predict there's going to be a huge hullabaloo next year. It's already starting, leading up to December 1948, which is going to be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you can, if some of you want to make some money from journals, you can write the articles right now, and send them to the Atlantic Monthly and the Boston Globe and so on when the right time comes. And the articles will say, we're standing up for the universality of the Universal Declaration, and we have to defend that against the third world relativists who think that you shouldn't, that there's special cultural relativism and so on and so forth, and we can't stand that because it's universal, and there can't be any, et cetera, et cetera. You can write the articles right now. If you're not original enough to write them, you can go back to the huge flood of articles that appeared in 1993 when the Vienna Conference was taking place and the United States was standing up courageously to defend the universality against the third world relativists and so on and so forth. Those are the articles you can write if you want to get a fee. If you want to get a kill fee, not even a kill fee, like get kicked off the newspaper if you're on it, or not get your article published, you can write an article which is the truth. The truth is that the United States is one of the leaders in rejecting the universality of the Universal Declaration. It flatly rejects one whole component of it as having no status whatsoever, namely all the social and economic rights. I mean, they have the same status as the so-called anti-torture rights, but the United States doesn't like them. I mean, they call for things like people being free from hunger, having having health care, having a job, having security. I mean, all that kind of stuff we don't believe in. It's there, like the guys who make the noises. They don't believe in that, and the official U.S. position is these things have no status. The way Gene Kirkpatrick put it rather crudely, they're like a letter to Santa Claus, But they're right there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They don't count because the U.S. rejects them, okay? If you go to the so-called, the ones that we theoretically do support, like Article 13, it's sheer hypocrisy. I mean, there's nothing more hypocritical that I know of than what happened with Article 13. I mean, here, year after year after year, big demonstrations, editorials, fusses about supporting half of Article 13, the half that you can use as a weapon to beat the Russians over the head with, but not mentioning the other half of Article 13, which we're opposing, not mentioning it. Go back and do a database search. Here's a nice research project for anyone who wants not to get a degree in a good political science department. Do a research job and see if you can find out when somebody mentioned those missing words or returned to their own country, meaning Palestinians return or get compensation. Okay. Well, we didn't like that, so therefore it was cut out. The hypocrisy on this is mind-boggling. Take Article 14, the next one. It says that everyone has, refugees have a right to asylum, right? Yeah. I mean, the day of the Vienna Conference opened with Warren Christopher over there talking about universality, blah, 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 and the editorial writers and, everyone screaming about it. That day, the Clinton administration turned back another boatload of Haitians fleeing from this murderous terror regime. Haiti is at that time being blockaded, of course, illegally, by the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard actually, which was sending back victims of terror to further terror. I mean, the whole thing is so outlandishly contrary to every element of international law, you don't even know where to start. I mean, like if Libya was, had the United States under a blockade, so you couldn't leave the country, people would think there's something wrong, But when we put a blockade around Haiti to keep people fleeing from torture and terror from doing so, as we are, and of course not accepting them here as we're required to do under Article 14, it's not even barely mentioned. Actually, the Globe reporter somewhere, the Globe had a mention of it, a line in a story about something else. Forget what the story was about, but in a story about something else, they actually had a mention of this. I don't think the Times and the Post even covered it. Here's the day of the Vienna Conference when everybody's screaming about the third world relativists who don't believe in the universality and so on. Well, it just goes on and on like this. I mean, I think the U.S. is now one of the 3 countries in the world, last time I saw, which hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just words. It becomes applicable when you have enabling legislation which says, okay, we'll do something about it. The United States has one of the worst records in the world on this. It doesn't pass enabling legislation on almost any issue, and when it does pass enabling legislation, it is always what's called non-self-executing, meaning cannot be applied in U.S. courts. Okay? So it means zero. No support. In fact, our support for the Universal Declaration is approximately zero. Well, these are things that ought to be brought up as the hysteria begins. In fact, before it begins, so you can maybe preempt it a little. What the chances are of getting the truth on this issue, I don't know, but it's worth working on. Not just to expose what's going on, but because the Universal Declaration is important. I mean, those rights really matter, you could maybe make a better set, but it's an impressive declaration, and it's kind of like a minimum of what decent people ought to be for. And if there are relativists who say we don't have to live up to them, well, that should be exposed. And if the relativists are sitting right here in Harvard Square in Washington, yeah, it's even more important to expose it, especially when they're leading the crusade against the Universal Declaration. So I think it's a good thing to do. And an important campaign, because it's going to be a major issue leading up to the 50th anniversary. You can be sure of that. I just wrote an article about it, just running through a lot of the details, which are pretty amazing when you look at it. It'll appear in some anthology in England in about 25 years or something. I mean, you can have it if you want. Just, no, well, they haven't asked for it yet. If you're interested, I'll send you a copy. Really? Wow. How'd that happen?
On the ZNet page.
Really? Okay.
I think Professor Chomsky will stick around and talk informally after this, but I'd like to, if possible, wrap it up. So, thank you, Professor Chomsky. Professor Noam Chomsky.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.